The HOA built 23 luxury cabins on my private island, and the president just laughed in my face when I told her to stop. She handed me a bill for trespassing, and then had her crew bulldoze the dock my wife and I built with our own hands. So, I let them finish construction. I watched them build every single cabin and pour every foundation. They thought they had me cornered because my original deed was missing, but they didn't know I was secretly building a case that would turn their multi-million-dollar project into my retirement plan. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, because you have to see their faces when I pull out the deed in court. And if you believe no HOA bully should ever steal a family's legacy, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss the moment their entire empire crumbles. The morning started like any other. I was on the dock with a hot mug of black coffee, watching the mist burn off the lake. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that gets inside you and settles your bones. I'd been an Army engineer for 35 years, and that kind of quiet was what I'd earned. This spot, this little slice of water and woods, was the only place that ever felt truly like home. My wife, Helen, and I had built this dock ourselves, board by board, the summer after I got back from my last deployment. Every nail was a memory. Then I heard it. A low, grinding rumble from across the water. It wasn't a fishing boat. It was the distinct growl of heavy machinery. Diesel engines complaining as they clawed over rock and dirt. I stood up, coffee forgotten in my hand, and saw them. A whole convoy of construction trucks, a bulldozer, a flatbed carrying prefab walls, a cement mixer, rolling right over the old causeway that connected the mainland to my island. My island, not the island. Mine. My father bought it in 1954, a 7-acre chunk of granite and pine sticking out of the lake, a place he called his splinter of heaven. He left it to me. It was in my name, on my tax bill, and on every map of this county for the last 70 years. I walked to the end of my lawn, where the water lapped at the shore, and watched them. They didn't even slow down. The lead truck, a big Ford with the logo of the Maple Shores Community Association on the door, lumbered onto the island shore and kept going. My first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. It had to be a mistake. A driver who took a wrong turn, a surveyor who couldn't read a map. I got in my old John boat and puttered across the 30 yards of water, separating my property from theirs. By the time I beached the boat and walked up the gravel path, a woman was waiting for me. She was in her 50s, wearing crisp khaki pants and a polo shirt with the same Maple Shores logo. She held a clipboard like a shield. "Can I help you?" she asked, and the tone wasn't helpful. It was the kind of tone that meant, state your business and get lost. I introduced myself. "I'm Jack Rains. I own this island. I think your crew has made a mistake." She looked down at her clipboard, then back up at me, and a little smirk played on her lips. "No mistake, Mr. Rains. I'm Karen Hensley, president of the HOA. This is designated common property. We're beginning construction on Phase 3 of the community expansion." I just stared at her. It felt like she was speaking another language. Common property? This land has been in my family for 3 generations. It's a private parcel. She tapped her clipboard with a perfectly manicured finger. "According to our updated plats, the island was incorporated into the Maple Shores Development Plan. We're building 23 rental cabins here. It's going to be a wonderful amenity for our residents." It was all I could do to keep my voice level. An engineer solves problems. You don't solve problems by shouting. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your plats are wrong. I have the deed. I'd be happy to show it to you." And that was my first mistake, admitting I had to prove something that was already mine. I went home, my mind racing, and started tearing through the old filing cabinet in my office. Helen had handled all the important paperwork. She was meticulous, organized everything by date and category, but the file for the island deed wasn't where it was supposed to be. I spent 3 hours turning the office upside down. I went through old boxes in the attic, checked the safe, looked in every drawer and file I could find. Nothing. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Without that piece of paper, my claim was just a story. A week later, a certified letter arrived. It was from the Maple Shores Community Association. Inside was a formal notice of encroachment fee. They were billing me $250 for obstructing their land use with my unpermitted personal effects, meaning the small fire pit and 2 chairs I kept near the shore. They were building on my land, and they were sending me a bill for being on it. The rage started to build then, a slow, hot burn. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about Helen. That island was our place. We'd planned to build a small cabin there ourselves one day, a place for our daughter Dana and the grandkids to stay. The dock they were about to tear down was the first thing we ever built together. I remembered her laughing as I mishit a nail and swore, the scent of fresh-cut pine, the feel of her hand in mine as we sat on the edge at sunset, our feet dangling in the cool water. I went back over there the next day. The crew was already clearing trees. The sound of chainsaws screamed across the water. Karen Hensley was there again, directing a man with a blueprint. I walked right up to her. "This has to stop," I said, my voice harder this time. "You are on private property. You are destroying a memorial to my late wife. I am asking you, politely, to pack up your equipment and leave." She turned to me, her face a mask of patronizing pity. She didn't even look at the trees falling. She just looked at me. "Mr. Rains, I understand this is emotional for you, but you need to see the bigger picture. We're increasing your property value. Once our beautiful cabins are built, your own home will be worth twice as much. You should be thanking us." That was it. The moment I knew reasoning with her was like trying to reason with a rock. I was an old man to her, a sentimental fool standing in the way of progress and profit. She saw my grief as a weakness to be managed, not a right to be respected. And as I stood there, speechless, she gave a little nod to the bulldozer operator. "Clear the shoreline," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "All of it." The operator gave me a nervous look, but he did what he was told. The big machine roared to life, its steel blade lowering. I yelled, "No, stop! That's my dock!" But no one was listening. Karen just watched, that same smug smirk on her face. The bulldozer lurched forward, and with a horrifying splintering crash, the first planks of the dock buckled and snapped. It tore through the structure in seconds, reducing 60 years of family history and a lifetime of my most precious memories to a pile of broken, floating lumber. And all I could do was stand there and watch it happen. My first call was to the county planning office. I still believed in the system then. I thought a simple mistake had been made, one that a person with a clear head and the right paperwork could fix. I filed a formal complaint for illegal construction and trespass. I detailed the property line, the history of ownership, and the destruction of my dock. For 2 weeks I heard nothing but the sound of saws and hammers across the lake. Then I got a call. An inspector was coming to the site, and I was invited to be present. I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone was going to listen. I was standing on my lawn when the county truck pulled up. A tired-looking man in a safety vest got out, clipboard in hand. Before I could even shake his hand, a sleek black sedan pulled in behind him. Karen Hensley got out of the passenger side, followed by a man in a crisp suit carrying a leather briefcase. This was her lawyer. The inspector, a man named Harris, sighed like this was already wasting his lunch break. "Okay, folks, let's see what we've got." He listened to my side first. I spoke calmly, laying out the facts. I pointed to where my dock used to be. I explained that the island had never, in its entire history, been part of the Maple Shores development. The lawyer didn't say a word. He just opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, professionally bound stack of papers. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "if you'll look at these updated plats, filed and approved last October, you'll see the parcel in question was officially zoned for community expansion. It's all here. Soil reports, environmental impact statements, the works." He handed the binder to the inspector. Harris flipped through a few pages, his eyes glazing over at the jargon and dense print. He looked at the impressive-looking maps, all stamped and signed. He looked at me, a 62-year-old man with nothing but a story. Then he looked at the lawyer and the HOA president, who looked like a team that had all their ducks in a row. He handed the binder back. "Looks like your paperwork is in order," he said to the lawyer. He turned to me and gave me that look. The look you get from a bureaucrat who has already decided you're the problem. "It's a civil issue, sir, not a county one. You'll have to take it up with them." And with that, he got back in his truck and drove away. Hope died a little that day. Karen Hensley gave me a look that was pure triumph. She didn't have to say a word. The message was clear. We have the right papers. You have nothing. The very next morning, her victory lap began. A crew arrived and installed a 10-foot-tall chain-link fence across the entire length of the causeway. They pounded in steel posts and hung a huge aluminum sign that read, "Private access, Maple Shores residents only. Violators will be prosecuted." They had fenced me out of my own island. I tried talking to my neighbors, people I'd known for years. Most of them were part of the HOA. They'd nod and listen, their faces full of sympathy. "That's just terrible, Jack." One of them, a man named George, whispered to me over the fence. "But Karen, you know how she is. She fined my wife $50 last week because our recycling bin was 6 inches too close to the curb. I can't afford to get on her bad side." No one wanted to help. They were all trapped in the same web of petty rules and fines, too scared to make a fuss. I was completely on my own. That weekend, while cleaning out my workshop, I found a little bit of hope tucked away in an old chest. It was a rolled-up tube of paper, tied with a brittle string. I unrolled it carefully on my workbench. It was a survey map of the property, hand-drawn in ink, dated 1956. It clearly showed the island as a separate parcel, with my family's name listed as the owner. My heart pounded. This was it. This was the proof I needed. I traced the property lines with my finger, the lines my father must have walked with the surveyor all those years ago. But as my eyes scanned the bottom of the page, my stomach dropped. In the space for the county surveyor's signature and official seal, it was blank. It was just a draft, a beautiful, detailed, and completely useless piece of paper. It wouldn't stand up for 2 seconds against Karen's professionally printed binder. It was like finding a key, only to realize the lock had been changed. My last resort was to appeal to them directly. The HOA held monthly meetings in the community clubhouse. I went, determined to make them see. Reason. The room was full of residents, and Karen was at the front, running the meeting like a drill sergeant. When the floor opened for new business, I stood up. I started to explain the situation again, my voice shaking slightly with a mix of anger and desperation. I hadn't gotten 2 sentences out before Karen cut me off. "Mr. Rains, this issue has been resolved. We are not discussing it again." A few of her board members chuckled. Someone in the back snickered. Humiliation washed over me. I tried to speak again, but she banged her gavel. "If you continue to disrupt this meeting, we will have you removed and banned from all future meetings." I looked around the room, at the faces of my neighbors. They were all looking down, studying their shoes, pretending they couldn't hear. I walked out of that clubhouse with my head held high, but inside, I felt like I was shrinking. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood on my shoreline, where my dock used to be, and just stared across the water. The island was lit up with huge floodlights. I could see the skeletons of cabins rising against the night sky. The sounds of generators and late-night work echoed across the lake. They were working around the clock, racing to finish. The hot rage I'd felt when they crushed my dock was gone. The desperation I'd felt in that meeting was gone too. It had all burned away, leaving something else in its place, something cold, quiet, and hard as granite. I watched them build on my land, my history, my memories. I watched them pour the foundations and raise the walls. And a new thought took root. A calm, clear plan that pushed all the emotion aside. If they want to build on my land, let them finish. I'd been an engineer my whole life. And there's one thing engineers do best: we prove things. For the next 4 months, the sounds of construction became the soundtrack to my life. The beeping of trucks backing up was my alarm clock. The whine of circular saws was the background noise to my lunch. The percussive thud of nail guns was the last thing I heard before the sun went down. Spring turned into a hot, sticky summer. I watched as 23 identical cabins rose from the scarred earth of my island. They framed the walls, ran the wiring, and put on the roofs. I saw them install picture windows that looked out over the lake, windows that looked right into my living room. From my side of the water, it looked like a small, tidy village had sprung up overnight. A village built on a lie. To anyone watching, especially to Karen Hensley and her board, I must have looked like a broken man. I gave up trying to cross the causeway. I stopped making calls. I just went about my days. I mowed my lawn in perfectly straight lines. I spent hours on the water in my John boat, fishing for Boss. I sat on my porch and read old engineering manuals. Karen would sometimes stand on the far shore, hands on her hips, watching me. I'd give her a polite, empty little wave. She'd just stare back, the architect of a tiny stolen kingdom, convinced she had won. They were so confident that they started advertising. A big glossy sign went up next to the chained gate. Maple Shores Lakeside Cabins, now accepting summer rentals. They were listed on vacation websites with beautiful sun-drenched photos and glowing descriptions about pristine, untouched nature, my nature. But while they were building their cabins, I was building my case. My days weren't as idle as they looked. Twice a week, I'd drive 30 miles to the county seat and spend my afternoons in the public records archive. It was a cold, quiet basement room that smelled of old paper and dust. I wasn't looking for my missing deed anymore. I knew it was gone. I was looking for theirs. I started with the updated plats their lawyer had brandished. It took me a week of digging through chronological filings, but I finally found the developer's submission from the previous October. It was all there, just as the lawyer had said, except for one tiny critical detail. In the state of an official land transfer or boundary adjustment has to be recorded with the state registry, not just filed with the local county office. There was no state seal, no registration number. The developer, probably with Karen's blessing, had filed it locally to get their construction permits, but they had skipped the final legal step. They had built a multi-million-dollar project on an unrecorded, legally worthless piece of paper. It was the first crack in the foundation. Next, I called an old friend. Earl Sutton had been the county surveyor for 40 years before he retired. We'd served in the same engineering battalion back in the day, though decades apart. He lived 2 towns over, and when I showed up at his door with a box of donuts and my problem, he sat me down at his kitchen table. Earl was 75, with hands as steady as the bedrock he used to map. I laid out the old, unsigned survey I'd found in my workshop. He studied it through his bifocals, his finger tracing the lines my father had commissioned. "I remember this one," he said quietly. "Old man Hemlock did this survey. He was a stickler. See this notation here?" He pointed to a small symbol on the corner of the island. "That's an iron pin, a 3/4-inch rebar driven 5 feet into the ground. Hemlock used them to mark every corner. Paper can lie, Jack. People can lie. But 100 pounds of iron driven into granite doesn't just get up and walk away." He gave me the original coordinates for the 4 corner markers from his personal logbooks, which he kept in his garage like sacred texts. Armed with those coordinates, I made another call. Not to a lawyer, but to a modern surveying firm, run by a young veteran I'd met through the VFW. I didn't tell him about the HOA. I didn't tell him about the fight. I just gave him a simple, technical job. I hired him to conduct a full boundary survey of my parcel using the original 1954 deed description, verified with the coordinates Earl gave me and cross-referenced with the Army Corps of Engineers' satellite topographical data. I wanted undeniable proof, measured down to the centimeter. 2 weeks later, a courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was a certified survey map, printed on heavy paper with a raised seal. It showed my property lines in a thick black line, and scattered inside the black line, like red measles, were the precise GPS-plotted locations of all 23 cabins. Every single one of them, from the front steps to the back porch, was squarely, entirely on my land. I folded the map, placed it in the envelope, and slid it into the bottom of my late wife's hope chest. The weapon was ready. It just needed to be loaded. A few days later, Karen Hensley gave an interview to the local newspaper. There was a big picture of her, smiling, standing in front of the new cabins. She called the project a triumph of community vision. She talked about overcoming challenges and dealing with a few bitter individuals who are resistant to progress. Reading her words, a strange calm settled over me. Her arrogance was the best ammunition I could have asked for. She was so proud of what she had stolen. The next day I put on a clean shirt, got in my truck, and drove into town. I walked into a small office with a sign that said, "Notary Public." A pleasant woman sat behind the desk. I didn't say much. I just handed her a single piece of paper I had prepared. She watched as I signed my name at the bottom. Then she took the document, checked my driver's license, and with a firm, satisfying thud, pressed her official seal into the paper. I folded it carefully, slid it into a fresh envelope, and walked out into the sunshine. The first shot had been fired. They just hadn't heard it yet. Patience is a weapon, but sometimes the enemy shoots first. A few days after I filed my paperwork, one of Karen's little foot soldiers showed up at my door. He was a stocky guy in a security guard-style uniform, wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. He called himself the head of community compliance, which was a fancy title for a guy who used to be a mall cop. He didn't knock, he just slapped a piece of paper on my front door with a loud thwack. It was an official-looking notice, complete with the Maple Shores HOA logo. It was a trespassing warning, for me, accusing me of attempting to access HOA-controlled property via the causeway. It was a joke, but it wasn't funny. They were building a paper wall to match their chain-link fence. That was just the opening shot. 2 days later, another letter came, this time in the mail. It was a fine for wanting $200. The reason listed was verbal harassment of contractors, citing the day I had stood on the shore and yelled for them to stop as they bulldozed my dock. They had twisted my desperate plea into an act of aggression. They were rewriting history, one invoice at a time, and charging me for the ink. My daughter Dana called that evening. She'd heard about the fine from one of her friends who lived in the community. Her voice was tight with worry. "Dad, this has to stop. You can't keep fighting them. They have lawyers and insurance and a whole board of people. You have a fixed income." I tried to tell her I had a plan, that I was handling it. Handling it? Dad, they're draining you. A $1,200 fine? What's next? They'll put a lien on your house. You can't fight City Hall, and you can't fight an HOA with a war chest. Please, just let it go. It's just land. It's not worth losing everything for. Her words stung more than any fine. She was just trying to protect me, but it felt like she was siding with them. She didn't understand. It wasn't just land. It was the last piece of Helen I had left. "I can't do that, honey," I said quietly, and the silence on the other end of the line felt 1,000 miles wide. The final public blow came the following Saturday. The HOA held a big ribbon-cutting ceremony for their new cabins. They invited the local paper and a crew from the regional news station. I watched from my lawn as they set up a podium on my island. Karen Hensley, dressed in a sharp blazer, stood in front of the cameras, beaming. She cut a big red ribbon with a pair of oversized golden scissors as a small crowd of HOA members applauded. I could hear bits of her speech drift across the water. She talked about growth, community, and providing beautiful new amenities. Then the reporter asked her about the controversy with the property line. Karen's smile became a practiced mask of concern. "It's a shame," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We've tried to be accommodating, but some people are just resistant to change. We have one bitter recluse who continues to cause problems, but we're confident the community will see the value in what we're doing here." Bitter recluse. The words were broadcast on the 6 o'clock news. They weren't just stealing my land, they were stealing my name. The very next week, the letter that truly scared me arrived. It was from my homeowner's insurance company. It was a short, brutally professional letter informing me that my policy was being canceled, effective in 30 days. The reason? Liability concerns arising from ongoing property disputes with an adjacent commercial development. Karen, or her lawyer, had clearly made a call. They had flagged my property as a risk. Without insurance, my mortgage would be in default. I could lose my home. Everything. This wasn't a fine anymore. This was a kill shot. That evening, for the first time since this all began, I felt a deep, crushing wave of defeat. I walked down to the shore and stood where my dock had been. The sun was setting, casting a golden light on the 23 perfect little cabins across the water. They looked solid, permanent. They looked like they'd always been there. The construction noise was gone. The island was quiet, waiting for its first paying guests. They'd done it. They had won. I thought maybe they'd already won. Maybe this was how small men get erased, one paper at a time. I was just one man, and they were a machine. A machine that printed notices and fines and lies until you were ground down to nothing. Was Dana right? Was I just a stubborn old fool throwing his life away on a memory? I stood there until the sky turned a deep starless purple. The world felt quiet and empty. I went back inside, the chill of the night air seeping into my bones. I walked into my office and sat down at the old wooden desk. For a long moment, I just stared at the wall. Then slowly, I reached down and pulled open the bottom drawer. It was mostly empty, save for a few old photographs and Helen's reading glasses. And lying on top of them was a single crisp manila envelope. The one with the notarized stamp. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. Inside was the certified survey, the hard proof of ownership from Earl's coordinates, and the document I had signed in front of that pleasant woman in town. It was all there. Karen had her binder full of fancy, worthless paper. Her lawyers had their threats. The bank had its rules. But they were all just systems built by people. They were fallible. They could be beaten. I looked at the envelope, the one real thing in a mountain of lies. Paper can lie, but deeds don't. I didn't sue them, not right away. Lawsuits are loud, and I needed quiet. I went to the county courthouse and filed what's called a quiet title action. It's a simple legal request that basically asks a judge to look at a piece of land and officially decide, once and for all, who owns it. The court sends a notice to anyone who might have a claim, in this case, the HOA, giving them 30 days to show up and prove it's theirs. If they don't show up, they lose by default. That I knew Karen. I knew how she thought. When that court notice landed on her desk, she didn't see a threat. She saw nuisance mail from a bitter recluse. She probably laughed and tossed it in the trash, confident that her shiny binder and slick lawyer had already settled everything. She didn't even bother to reply. 31 days later, I stood before a judge in a nearly empty courtroom. He looked at my certified survey, Earl's original coordinate logs, and the unbroken chain of deeds my family had held since 1954. He looked at the empty defense table where the HOA should have been. He banged his gavel once, signed a court order confirming my absolute exclusive ownership of the 7-acre island, and that was it. I officially owned it again in the eyes of the law. They just didn't know it yet. But a piece of paper doesn't stop a bulldozer, as I'd already learned. I needed leverage, heavy leverage. I spent the next week making calls to some old colleagues in civil engineering. We talked shop. I asked them hypothetically what would happen if a developer built 23 residential units on land they didn't own, without state-level septic permits, directly over a protected watershed. You could practically hear them wince over the phone. "That's a federal EPA violation, Jack," one told me. "The fines alone would bankrupt a small town." Armed with my new court order and a list of specific code violations, I didn't go to the HOA. I went to the County Environmental Enforcement Division. I showed them the proof that 23 rental cabins were currently sitting on private land, my land, without a single valid permit from the actual owner. Bureaucracy is slow when you want help, but it's lightning fast when it smells a lawsuit. The next morning, the cavalry arrived. Not police, but 3 county code enforcement trucks. They crossed the causeway, ignoring Karen's private access sign, and went to work. I watched from my porch with a pair of binoculars as they slapped bright orange "Stop Work, Do Not Occupy" stickers on the door of every single cabin. It was the most beautiful decoration I'd ever seen. Karen Hensley exploded. I could hear her shrieking across the water as she tried to physically block a county worker from tagging the model unit. He just pointed to his clipboard and kept writing. Within an hour, an emergency email blast went out to every resident in Maple Shores. The subject line was in all caps: "Urgent community meeting, resident obstruction." She was going to try to crush me publicly, once and for all. The community center was packed that night, standing room only. The mood was ugly. People were worried about their property values, scared by the sudden arrival of county enforcement. They wanted someone to blame, and Karen had served me up on a platter. I walked in quietly 10 minutes late and stood comfortably in the back row, leaning against the wall. I wore my old Army field jacket. Karen was up at the podium, red-faced, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. "We have spent millions improving this community," she shouted into the microphone, "and one man, because of a personal vendetta, is trying to sabotage your investment. He's calling in frivolous complaints, wasting taxpayer money, and harassing our board." Rick, the security guard, was scanning the room for me, cracking his knuckles. "We will not be intimidated," Karen continued, slamming her hand on the podium. "I have already spoken to our attorneys. We are filing an immediate lawsuit against Jack Rains for tortious interference and obstruction of commerce. We will take his house if we have to." The room erupted in angry shouts. People turned and glared at me. It was a mob, and she was holding the pitchforks. I waited for the noise to die down just a little. Then I pushed off the wall and started walking down the center aisle. It's a long walk when 300 people hate your guts. I didn't rush. I just kept my eyes on Karen. She saw me coming and smiled a nasty, triumphant little smile. "Oh, look who decided to show up." Do you have something to say for yourself, Mr. Rains? Or are you just here to see the damage you've caused? I reached the front of the room. I didn't go to the microphone. I walked right up to the table where the rest of the HOA board was sitting, the treasurer, the secretary, the VP, looking uncomfortable. I didn't yell. I just spoke loud enough for the first few rows to hear me clearly. Before you file that lawsuit, Karen, you might want to check your paperwork one more time. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the certified court order, stamped with the state seal, heavy and official. I dropped it on the table in front of the board. It hit the wood with a heavy, decisive thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "That's a court order from Judge Patterson," I said, my voice steady. "It was issued 3 days ago. It confirms that I am the sole legal owner of the island, and it designates every structure you built on it as an illegal encroachment." Karen's face went pale. She grabbed the paper, her hands shaking, and tried to read it. This is fake. We have the plats." I leaned in close, so only she and the board could hear the steel in my voice. "Your plats are unrecorded drafts. My deed is court verified. You didn't build an expansion, Karen. You built 23 luxury cabins completely on my land." I turned to face the room. The silence was absolute now. Every eye was on me. "And as of this morning," I said, raising my voice so the back row could hear, "I'm evicting you." The room didn't just erupt this time. It exploded. Chaos broke loose. Karen snatched the court order, her eyes scanning the page wildly. "This is a forgery!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "He printed this himself! It's fake!" She crumpled the corner of the paper in her fist. The room was a boiling pot of confusion, neighbors shouting questions at the board, at me, at each other. Karen pointed a trembling finger at me. "He is a liar and a fraud, and we will see him in court." But I had planned for this. Just as the uproar reached its peak, the back door of the community center opened. A mild-mannered man in a county uniform walked in. It was Cliff Marks, the chief records clerk from the courthouse. He walked calmly up to the podium, looking deeply uncomfortable with being the center of attention. I had called him an hour earlier and asked him as a favor if he would be willing to verify a public document. "Ma'am," Cliff said, his voice quiet but carrying through the microphone Karen had left on. "That is an official order from the Superior Court, signed by Judge Patterson. I processed it myself 3 days ago. It's as real as this podium." The room went dead silent. The truth landed with the force of a physical blow. You could see the realization spreading across the faces in the crowd like a wave. Karen stared at Cliff, her mouth hanging open. The power was draining from her face, leaving behind a splotchy, panicked mask. A man in the front row, one of the board members, stood up. "Karen, what is he talking about? You told us the land was zoned and cleared." That one question broke the dam. Suddenly everyone had a question. "You used our reserve funds for this," a woman yelled. "My special assessment fees went into this fraud," another shouted. The mob she had created just minutes before had turned, and now they were coming for her. Karen stumbled backward, away from the podium, her eyes darting from face to face. She started blaming everyone else. The developer gave us the plats. He assured us everything was filed," she stammered. Our lawyers approved it." I stepped up to the microphone. "It's simpler than all that," I said, my voice calm and clear. The room fell silent again, listening. I pulled the certified survey map from my jacket and unfolded it, taping it to the wall for everyone to see. The original surveyor, back in 1956, drove iron pins into the ground to mark the corners of my family's property. They never moved. I pointed to the map. I had a new survey done, using GPS coordinates from federal satellites, and they matched the old pins down to the inch. I then pulled out the HOA's own unrecorded plat. "This document," I said, holding it up, "was never filed with the state. It has no legal power to transfer land. You can't just draw new lines on a map and call it yours." The residents stared at the two maps. One, a complex grid of engineering data with an official seal. The other, a cheap-looking printout. It was so simple, so clear, that even in their anger, they understood. They had been lied to. Karen saw her support completely collapsing. She grabbed her gavel from the table and banged it repeatedly. "This meeting is adjourned! Adjourned!" she yelled, trying to regain control. But no one was listening to her anymore. The board treasurer was already on his phone, presumably with the HOA's real lawyer. As Karen tried to push her way through the angry crowd toward the exit, the doors opened again. This time, it wasn't a county clerk, it was 2 county sheriff's deputies, and my daughter, Dana, was standing right behind them, her phone up, recording everything. One of the deputies, a woman with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward and handed Karen a stack of papers. "Karen Hensley," the deputy said, her voice cutting through the noise, "you are being served with a cease and desist order for trespassing on private property, as well as citations for multiple environmental and building code violations. You are to remove yourself from the premises immediately." It was the final public humiliation. The moment of total defeat. Karen's face crumpled. The tough, clipboard-wielding tyrant was gone, replaced by a panicked, cornered woman. She started to cry, not tears of remorse, but of rage. "You can't do this to me," she wailed, as news crews, who had been lingering outside since the ribbon cutting, now pushed their way in, cameras flashing. They swarmed her as the deputies calmly escorted her out of the building. She was still screaming about her lawyers and her rights as she was guided past the sign for her beautiful new cabins, now covered in orange stickers. The crowd inside stood in stunned silence, watching the meltdown. I walked back to the podium, picked up Karen's gavel, and placed it gently on the table. My work was done. As I watched the flashing lights of the sheriff's car pull away, I thought about all the shouting and threats, the fines and the fake documents. And I realized justice doesn't always have to shout back. Sometimes it just signs its name quietly in blue ink. The implosion of the Maple Shores Community Association was faster and more spectacular than I could have imagined. After Karen was escorted out, the meeting descended into a chaotic free-for-all of accusations and panic. The remaining board members, realizing they were legally on the hook for millions in unpermitted construction, resigned on the spot, right there in front of everyone. The video Dana took of Karen's meltdown went viral in our little part of the state. Within a week, the residents held an emergency vote, and the motion to dissolve the HOA passed with a 98% majority. The lawyers they had to hire to untangle the financial mess discovered Karen and her developer partner had been cooking the books for years. She was facing charges for fraud and embezzlement on top of the environmental violations. The developer, the one who provided the fake plats, vanished. His company declared bankruptcy, and he was last seen boarding a flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The residents were left with a mountain of debt, but they were free. They had to pay a final assessment to cover the legal fees, but they did it gladly. It was the price of their liberation. For me, the victory was quiet, but it came with a very large, very complicated problem. I was now the reluctant owner of 23 brand new, half-finished, and completely illegal cabins. They were a monument to Karen's greed, sitting on my land. Tearing them down would have cost a fortune and been a colossal waste. An engineer doesn't destroy a well-built structure if he can find a better use for it. So I did what I do best. I made a plan. I spent the next 2 months on the island, not as a victim, but as a project manager. I hired my own crews, honest ones this time. We brought every single cabin up to code. We drilled new wells, installed state-approved septic systems, and remediated the land where they'd bulldozed irresponsibly. I paid for it all out of my savings, a final gamble on my own competence. When everything was done, permitted, and inspected, I had 23 pristine lakeside cabins, fully legal and ready for market. I put them up for sale, not as rentals, but as individual properties. They sold in less than a month, at the peak of the summer season. The profit was staggering. My daughter Dana sat with me at my kitchen table as I looked at the final bank statement. The number was so large it didn't seem real. "You're rich, Dad," she said, her voice full of awe. "You could buy a boat. You could travel the world." I just shook my head. The money was never the point. It was a tool, a byproduct of setting things right. The next day I wrote 2 checks. The first one repaid my savings account down to the penny. The second check was for half of the remaining total. I made it out to a national trust that builds and provides mortgage-free homes for wounded veterans and their families. I mailed it with a short, simple letter. "In memory of my wife, Helen Raines," I wrote. "She always believed a home was the safest harbor in the world." That was my victory, turning the ugliest chapter of my life into a legacy she would have been proud of. The change in the community was almost immediate. Once the HOA signs came down, it felt like everyone could breathe again. People started talking to each other over their fences, not in whispers, but in friendly shouts. George, the neighbor who'd been too afraid to speak up, came over one weekend with his 2 sons and a truck full of lumber. "Heard you might be in need of a new dock," he said, looking a little embarrassed. We'd be honored to help. More neighbors showed up. We spent a whole Saturday working together, measuring, sawing, and hammering under the hot sun. It felt good. We built a new dock, stronger and better than the one Helen and I had built, but it had the same spirit. That afternoon, as we sat on the finished structure drinking cold beers, George proposed something. He said the lake didn't feel like Maple Shores anymore. At the next town council meeting, he officially petitioned to have our little corner of the lake renamed. The motion passed unanimously. The sun is coming up now. I'm sitting on the new dock, a hot mug of black coffee in my hands. The mist is burning off the water, just like it did on that first morning. It's quiet again, the deep, settling quiet I thought I had lost forever. Across the water, on my island, lights are starting to come on in the windows of the cabins. New families are waking up, starting their own memories in the houses that were born from such ugliness. They're good neighbors. We all are now. They thought they could take a man's peace with a piece of paper, but paper burns. Stone lasts. A few weeks ago, the last remnant of the old world came down. Someone took down the big, ugly Maple Shores community sign at the entrance to our road. In its place, there's a new one. It's not fancy. It's hand-painted on a nice piece of cedar in simple, friendly letters. It just says, "Welcome to Rains. Point, respect the lake."